just te karakia. Mauri mauri tu mauri ora kia tātou. Haumie huie tai kie. No mai haere mai e te whānau. I'm ko Karen Driver tōku ingoa. Ki whakatū e noho ana. I'm the chair of Zero Waste Aotearoa. Today's focus is sharing what we're thinking about the Ministry's proposals to update the WMA and the Litter Act. We're really keen to hear what you think, and please, if you can, please leave questions until after Sue's presentations and sorry. But feel free to add comments and questions in the chat, and also to comment and answer other people's questions. It's a group think, not a one-way stream. So it's really important for us to hear what you're thinking, and it'll help everybody else as well. So I'll hand over to Sue. So Sue's been working in the zero waste sector for more than 20 years. I'm sure most of you will know her. She's practical experience from running Wastebusters and helping to develop the Zero Waste Network. Nowadays, she works on advocacy with the network, and we're extremely lucky to have her. So if you want to just put into the chat where you're zooming in from, that'd be really good, and just to know where people are from. And also, can you highlight as we go through if there's any red flags for you or anything you know now? Yeah, over to you, Sue. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks so much, Karen, and really great to see so many of you here today coming in to listen in to what we're share our thinking so far, and to, obviously I'm going to be focusing on what we think is most important, and so there'll be things that you guys know of, like Karen's saying, that might be red flags or areas that you'd really like to explore further. So yeah, just throw them in the chat and we can get to that. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes or a little bit longer maybe, and then we'll just have plenty of time for questions. So there's two main things that I'm going to focus on. One is the product stewardship framework and how extended producer responsibility fits into that. And then the second thing is the changes to how the waste disposal levy is distributed and used and applied. And then a few other little bits and pieces at the end, but that's the main focus for me today. It's really good for us all to keep in mind that this proposal outlines some amendments to the current Waste Minimisation Act. It's not the comprehensive overhaul that we were working on, a couple of years ago when the Labor government was in. It's a tidy up job. And so if we look back at the consultation on the waste strategy and legislation back in 21, then the cabinet papers and there's a whole series of cabinet papers that dropped out of that work, then these proposals mostly relate to cabinet paper 4 on the waste levy and the general compliance regime, and cabinet paper 5 on the EPR framework. It doesn't really include the work done in cabinet paper 2 on regulating products and materials, which covered things like bans, environmental performance across the life cycle, information labelling. And it doesn't cover what was in cabinet paper 3 on regulating how people manage waste, which was a lot about duty of care and licensing provisions, which I know were important for councils. When we're thinking about, if we... sorry, gone through board 2. Bit of a lag and jumping forward on my slides.
Sue, can you just speak up a little bit, please?
Yeah. I've got a big time lag on my slide. Can you share the presentation, Karen, and move it through for me? I just have got a really slow... I can't seem to get my slides to go forward or back. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so if we think about, if we start from product stewardship, the proposal is to replace the product stewardship provisions in Section 2 of the WMA with an extended producer responsibility.
Yeah, so people still can't hear you very well.
Okay. Okay, sorry about the technical glitches, guys.
I'm going to share.
I'm going to swap over. Are you able to hear better now?
It's a bit better soon, but
that is a bit better.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry about that we've got a few glitches going on. I'm doing my best here with the tech, my tech support skills are a little bit low. Yep, so someone got a bit of a thumbs up on people being able to hear better. Great. Karen's just going to put the presentation up, but I'll just keep rolling along anyway. So we're on slide 2, Karen.
Yeah.
Taking a breath and getting started again. Okay, so basically where we are at the moment is that government needs to have access to a whole toolkit. If you can click back one. Thanks, that's awesome. Yeah, government needs to have access to a whole toolkit. Product stewardship proposal on the table is really about, extended producer responsibility, but that's only one piece of the puzzle. The proposal to replace the product stewardship provisions in Section 2 of the WMA with an extended producer responsibility framework won't really get us where we need to go. So the first question really is, do we support the proposal for a modern EPR framework? And we agree, yep, we need a better system for designing and implementing, running, funding, monitoring and reporting on schemes. And it's also critical that government's able to regulate outside of schemes and alongside schemes. So that's regulating the products themselves, could be e-waste or drink containers, the substances that they're made of, like particular kind of plastic, or could be a compound like PFAS, the situational context that they're being used in. So it could be, reusable cups, plates, and cutlery if you're sitting in-house having your lunch. And the characteristics of a product as well. So something like, single-use containers or single-use applications. So this list here describes the powers that government needs to have in its toolkit. And these tools can be used alone, they can be used in packages to shape the way that products and packaging flow through our economy and get used and repaired and reused and recycled and disposed of. Section 23 of the Act is where these kinds of powers sit now. And Section 23, the powers in Section 23 cover like the broader suite of tools that have ever been used. They're incomplete and they've also hardly ever been used in the life of the Act. They need to be much more clearly described, they need to be expanded, and they need to be modernised. And strengthening this product policy toolkit, which also includes the extended producer responsibility framework, is critical if we're serious about waste prevention and reduction. The proposals outline updates to powers from Section 9 to Section 22, which cover all the products and packaging that are covered by formal product stewardship schemes. And effective EPR schemes for packaging like drink bottles and cans and cartons, or products like textiles and e-waste, are really necessary and urgently needed. The basic set of powers that are described in Section 1 in Appendix 1 of the consultation document, that would enable us to do something like set up a deposit return scheme for drink containers, which is long overdue. But there's some areas in Appendix 1 in the table that really need to be strengthened to make sure that any EPR schemes we do put in place are really effective. So we need really strong reporting and reporting requirements to the public, as well as to the people that are paying for the scheme, as well as to the government. We need automatic increases to deposit rates or network convenience, for example, if the return rate targets aren't met, rather than just being able to review a scheme, but if the government and the minister feels they would like to. And targets need to go way beyond return rates, which just focus on what's collected, to include recycling targets, reuse targets, recycled content targets, for example. Okay, can you click on, Karen? Product policy, back one, thanks. Yeah, so product policy is way bigger than EPR. EPR is necessary, but it's not sufficient to get us where we need to go. If we think about what we're really trying to do, the latest news last week out on how circular our global economy is, we're sliding backwards. We'll drop down to 6.9% circular now. We're really, with these types of product policy tools, we're really trying to achieve much bigger picture goals. We're trying to reduce negative upstream impacts from extraction and production, trying to slow down material and energy flows. We're trying to keep products and materials in circulation for as long as possible. And we're trying to eliminate toxic and hazardous chemicals. And so all of those things are outside the scope generally of where EPR usually fits, which is down at the level of doing a reasonable job of recycling, collecting up materials. It's important that we have this both and approach. And it's really reasonable to expect that organizations that design and make and sell products and packaging should take the operational and the financial responsibility for setting up and running effective reuse and recycling schemes and systems, to take the burden off ratepayers and councils. And that's really especially important for remote rural districts that face higher transport costs and areas with big visitor numbers that have to cover the cost of recycling from a small ratepayer base. If you can get some cash coming in through the EPR schemes, then that really shifts the game. So EPR schemes focus downstream. They tend to focus on activities that collect, sort, and transport and recycle or dispose of products that have already been made and distributed. So that's something like Tirewise scheme is doing a good job of that. EPR schemes tend to get quite stuck on recycling. EXPRA, which is one of the big European PROs, put out a paper on what they've learned in the last 30 years about how to run a good EPR scheme. The section on preventing unnecessary packaging focused on guidelines for making packaging more recyclable. And the section on design for sustainability focused on using labels so the public could do a better job of sorting their recycling. They really can't imagine the idea of getting up into the top of the hierarchy. So New Zealand really needs to follow the best examples from around the world and create a producer responsibility framework that works for reuse and high quality recycling. And obviously that includes repair and all of the other activities that happen in that top of the hierarchy. So container return schemes, one of the best things about those is that they do put in place recycling for single-use drinks, bottles, cans, and cartons. But if you design them well, they can also be a really great transition strategy for shifting into bringing return for reuse and refill. And so because the harvesting system that you're setting up works really well for both. So one of the questions that MFE had in the consultation document was about input methodologies. I had a bit of a scavenger around in the cabinet papers and the other documents I could find, but I couldn't see a clear definition. One thing that stood out from the quick research that I did was that clear definitions and standardized calculation methodologies for both the financial side of things, like what has to be paid for and by who, and material flows, so that's kind of targets and whether they're achieved, are really critical. And the thing that's coming out of the work that's being done over in Europe, where they're onto at least product stewardship 2.0, is that financing needs to go way beyond the idea of what's cost efficient for managing waste at the end of its life through recycling or other strategies. The work being done in Europe suggests that you really need to have often a double fee structure, so that you're going to have an EPR or waste management fee that covers the cost of collecting and recycling products and materials, plus an environmental tax on top of that starts to ask the hard questions about whether it's durable, can be repaired, reused, refilled, what the carbon footprint is, whether it's safe, non-toxic, etc. So this type of eco-modulation is really about the environmental performance of the project, of the product, and not just about cost recovery. So it's about cost coverage that goes way beyond recycling into prevention, repair, reuse, and having really great transparent fee structures that clearly define the costs that producers need to cover, and standard cost calculation methodologies that's understanding what the real cost is of collecting, sorting, and transporting. And that's especially important where you might have producers responsible for paying for a scheme, but someone else like the council is actually running the scheme and doing all of the work involved. Okay, you can click on, Karen. So another question that's been asked in the consultation document is whether or not voluntary schemes should continue, whether government should continue to endorse them. I'd say voluntary schemes have just not delivered the results that we're looking for. There's not really much value in the public to the government and having them accredit them. Accreditation is a form of endorsement, and it can be like a bit of a greenwash. If you look at these examples of voluntary product stewardship schemes and we put them into a standard matrix, like, do they deliver results? So it's kind of like we've used return rate as a proxy, and do they cover the cost of an effective system that could deliver high return rates? You can see that the two that I've got in here, for example, the Glass Packaging Forum, a scheme to collect glass. The main job the scheme does is collect and provide data and reporting. It takes minimal operational responsibility. It's the councils and the commercial collectors who collect about 65% of what goes into the market, and then about 39% gets recycled back into bottles. So it's, reasonably low return and recycling rate. In terms of financial responsibility, the Packaging Forum puts about 192,000 in on small projects to collect glass, but that's less than 1% of the money that the council spend, 50 million plus, to collect and sort and recycle glass each year. If you look at where the soft plastic recycling scheme sits, it's pretty similar, in the lower left-hand corner. Soft plastic scheme do take a bit more operational financial responsibility for the scheme, but at this stage it's basically a bit of a token gesture. They collect and recycle less than 7% of the relevant soft plastics going to market, and it's the same whether you do that by unit or by weight. And by way of comparison, there's a good reason why the guy in the top right is smiling. Container deposit return schemes, you can get a really great result with those, 85% plus return. A well-designed scheme will cover its own cost, and it'll provide clean streams for closed loop recycling, give you a pathway into reuse, and gets really strong stakeholder engagement across the board. So we need, it's much more transparent if there's just one pathway for becoming a product stewardship or EPR scheme, and that all accredited schemes have to meet the same standard. It'd be much better for the government to apply scarce resources it has available to developing high-performing schemes for key product and material streams that are mandatory, comprehensive, and that the real costs are totally covered. Yeah, we could click on, Karen. Maybe back one. Yeah, that's great. So the second thing that I wanted to talk a bit about is the waste disposal levy. Now, the waste disposal levy has a very specific job. It's there to, does two jobs really: to act as a tax to collect a pool of capital that we can use to invest in making progress with our waste problems, and it also acts as just as a lever to make it more viable, in comparison, relatively more viable to get involved in recycling and other schemes up the hierarchy, other activities up the hierarchy. So the 80-20 formula that government's proposing, we think it's a much better way to allocate waste disposal levy funds to councils. Councils get about 50% of the levy funds at this point, and traditionally they've been distributed by just dividing by a population on a population basis. The new system is to take 20% of the funds and divide that evenly across all councils, so everyone gets a base rate, and then to apply the population formula on top of that. Larger councils will get a little bit less than they might have projected in their long-term plan budget, but small councils will get enough funding to be able to take some practical steps forward. And over time, as the levy increases, all councils will get more funds. In terms of, we've got, and it's good to remember that there's more than one tool in the toolkit for helping councils cover costs. As we said earlier, product stewardship or EPR schemes can help to cover the cost through schemes like Tirewise, or if a container return scheme gets implemented, then every drink container that gets sold in your district will pay its own way through the system, which takes the burden for paying off councils and ratepayers. And if you're in a remote or rural district that's got high transport costs or high visitor numbers, then that's going to be really important as an additional revenue stream. If we look at the scope of the use of levy funds, then one of the things that the proposal puts forward is the idea that last year in the change to the Waste Act, there was government was able to spend their 50% of the levy funds on a wider range of activities. And this year they're proposing that councils are also able to do the same thing. We would support the idea that councils are able to spend money on a slightly wider range of things. So that might include emergency waste, contaminated sites and vulnerable landfills, and mismanaged waste and litter. But we definitely don't support extending that to any activity at all that might reduce environmental harm or increase environmental benefits. So there's still so much we need to do to prevent and reduce waste, set up reuse, repair, recycling and composting systems, and to clean up problems created in the past. The levy money that we have really needs to be invested in solving our waste problems for once and for all. The amount of levy funding that councils receive is actually pretty small in comparison to their total spend on waste-related activities in their cities and districts. I've heard some numbers saying it's somewhere between 6 and 12%. We really need to spend on proactive waste reduction activities and cleaning up these contaminated sites and dealing with vulnerable landfills. And the need for all of that far outstrips the supply of levy or other funds that are available at the moment. The other thing that, another question that's being asked in this area is, the idea of decision-making criteria. What decision-making criteria should be used to prioritise central and local government spending of the waste levy? The focus of the question is really on, if they went wider and into the environmental sphere. But I think there's still a really valuable point that we all need to make, which is that, we really need to focus on using the waste hierarchy as our method for prioritising spend. We have to be spending in the top of the hierarchy if we want to make if we want to have any hope of making the transition to a low waste, low emissions economy. The waste levy is a really specific tool, and we have to use it as well as we can to, to make sure that we are preventing and reducing waste so that districts, cities, individual ratepayers and the country in general aren't facing, just steadily increasing costs and risks associated with waste. You all know that waste is massive scope. It's everything from prevention, behaviour change, education, redesigning products and business models, right down to dealing with these landfills that we've created in the past that are vulnerable to flooding and erosion now. Our waste problems are way bigger than the pot of cash that we have available to solving them, and current funding models are just not sufficient to cover the activities we have. The waste levy needs to be steadily increased, and we need to really focus on the top of the hierarchy. And we also need to bring all these other EPR and producer, product stewardship tools into play to support our shift up the hierarchy as well. Okay, click on Karen. Okay, so in relation to incineration, there's a proposal to remove the waste levy exclusion for waste to energy projects, and that would include the incinerators that we're seeing being proposed around the country. And a lot of these guys are basing their budget projections on not having to pay the waste disposal levy, so it'll be a great thing to see as applied. Now, we think waste disposal levy should apply to all disposal options, whether that's landfill or incineration. And there's a wide range of activities that use that waste to energy label. Could be anything from anaerobic digestions and burning wood chips, right through to incinerating mixed solid waste. In lots of cases, the waste to energy label is just a form of greenwash because the amount of energy generated per tonne of waste burned is actually very low. And really clear criteria would need to be established for determining which of these activities are disposal and which are legitimate renewable energy generation options, and then getting a clear explanation of how the levy might be applied across the spectrum. Yep, you could click on, Karen. And the last couple of points that I wanted to make are around compliance, monitoring and enforcement. It's a critical backstop to make sure that the things we don't want to happen don't happen, and the things we do want to happen do happen. It needs to be well resourced. Got to put the boots on the ground and commit to effective monitoring and enforcement and of all the different things that we're trying to get happening. The definitions and the calculation formulas need to be really clear and consistent. And it's not really clear from the consultation document how the framework would apply to EPR or other product stewardship activity. All the examples in the discussion relate to litter and mismanaged waste. In terms of the roles and responsibilities section, we definitely need to beef up the role of central government, and so that they can use the whole product stewardship toolkit, not just the EPR provisions. And it's only reasonable to expect that councils would meet a set of minimum obligations if they have the funds that they need to allocate to the work available, and if they're supported by government using all the tools it has at its disposal to fund recycling, etc., through EPR charges. We really need to be able to use the waste levy and other economic instruments to create investment capital that can be used for activity to prevent and reduce waste at the top of the hierarchy. So that whole package of tools is necessary. There's a question there about the Waste Advisory Board, and I think it's really important that the Waste Advisory Board is able to provide proactive advice at its discretion that could alert the minister to key issues for the sector. And it could also help to shape activity and proposals during development, rather than just giving feedback at the right at the very end of a process. And just one last thing about litter and mismanaged waste. We do think it makes sense to pull the Litter Act into the Waste Act, get everything all into one place, and we think that investment in staff and systems as well for compliance, monitoring, enforcement is critical in that space, and that applies both at central and local government levels. So that's about it from me on kind of the general things that we've been thinking about and the things that we are concerned about. So look forward to hearing any questions and hearing what people have to say.
Kia ora koutou.
And I guess love to see people piping up in the chat as well. If I'm stumbling around on an answer, I know we've got a lot of experts in the room here. It's great for people to put their thoughts into the chat as well. If you've got any, when you can see a question in there.
Okay, so just going through Sophie Mander, she mentioned that the population numbers should be considering visitor population as well as resident population, which makes sense for those areas like Queenstown that get a huge number of visitors every year, and they have to deal with their waste as well. So that's a really good. It wasn't a question as such; it was just more of a statement. But Val Bianchi, she mentioned that with all the expectations of that the government is putting onto TAs, that like monitoring litter and the additional compliance, that the baseline should actually be more like 25 to 30%. So what do you think of that? I think that makes sense.
It seemed I've talked to quite a few people from councils, and it seems as though the waste levy, the portion of the waste levy fund that councils are getting, is only such a small percentage of what they're spending in their districts anyway. So someone said 6 to 12% of their spending in their district is actually coming from the waste levy. So I agree that it would be good to see people getting, the money that they need. And as I was saying, we maybe need to look at how we can use some of those other producer responsibility tools and EPR schemes to take some of the cost burden off councils that they're facing at the moment, so that they can concentrate on the things that they're best placed to fund and pay for. So, we could use something like container return scheme would cover the cost of recycling bottles, cans and cartons, take that cost off councils and ratepayers. And then something like in some places they're using something like an environmental tax, which is applied on top of other, over and above EPR schemes, and that can be put into supporting things like repair, reuse, getting the infrastructure and the systems in place that we need to prevent and reduce waste in the first place. So I think we really need to have lots of tools in play at once, be thinking about how we can have packages to apply to these problems rather than just keeping on banging on about, I used your waste levy money to solve every problem that you've got.
Yeah, so that's, yeah. Val, you've got your hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself and?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, love to see you.
Yeah. Kia ora, everyone. I just have a question. It's kind of technical, and I've asked at the MFE webinar, and I didn't get a response. So I was just wondering if anyone might have some clarity. So on page 9 of the consultation document, they talk about the proposed EPR framework would include provisions for taking the following actions. And the first bullet point is that declaring priority products would change from a statutory to a non-statutory process. The way that reads for me is that we would, without maybe a level of further analysis that's needed, would be that we would want priority products to be declared as part of a statutory product process, so they have to do it. So that's my question, is just kind of if anyone has any insight onto what the implications of that would be.
The way that I've read it, Val, is that the intention is to take some of the long steps, the long early steps of having to go through consultation processes. I think I've been through at least 3 consultation processes since starting back maybe shortly after the Act, to say what should these priority products be, etc. I don't think it's necessarily connected to whether it's a product of interest or a priority product or whatever the label that ends up going on it. I think the intention of that statement is that the ministry could say, this product is a product of interest. We're going to call for someone to come forward and for people to come forward and be the PRO for this scheme and get the process started without having to go through such a long-winded process.
Yeah. Cool, thanks, Sue. Hannah,
great, thank you.
Maybe others have some thoughts on it. So, that's just my quick thought. Yeah.
No, that's cool. Hannah made a comment about EPR scheme fees should also extend to covering costs of the products that aren't recovered and that leak from the system, i.e. mismanaged waste and litter the priority products, as well as disposal costs. So that's more of a statement, but I think we'd agree with that, because there will be leakage.
Yeah, and I think all the work we see coming out of Europe is saying we can't just be talking about let's collect stuff and get it to recycling. We really have to be widening the horizons about what EPR is, so that it's looking at the material that's lost out of the system. It's looking at material that, is being, in Europe, a lot of work is done on, if you sorting through waste streams to be able to pull out material which is part of EPR schemes, and they don't at the moment get paid for that. So you can find a lot of bottles in the rubbish, for example, pull them out, put them into recycling, but that cost isn't covered by the producers. And so it's really contested space, the idea of who pays for what. It's really important to going back to that question about input methodologies, to be clear that we're not just talking about end of life, that we're not just talking about recycling, that we're extending out into litter, we're extending out into pollution, we're extending out into other costs at the bottom as well as upstream. And so a much wider conception of what could be paid for, and then also just having a much, a bit more options around which levers or economic instruments might we choose to use for different purposes. But I see Liam's got his hand up, so I'd like to hand over to him.
Hi, Liam.
Hey, thanks so much, and thanks for letting me jump in, just because I've got to head off a little early. I'm just going to divert into a different topic, but obviously we can go back to EPR after that. But and I must admit, I haven't actually read all of the consultation documents, but from what I've heard and what I can gather, there really isn't anything around organics and getting organics out of landfill. So I guess my question is there something that in submissions that we could recommend is included in an act like this around organics, or is it more? Do you think it's more something that is being dealt with kind of in the climate, emissions reduction plan type areas. Yeah, or if there is something that I've missed from the consultation, I'd be interested to hear it in that space. Thank you.
Yeah, I think going back to that earlier, kind of, I realized after reading through the document that it really is just a few small adjustments or amendments to the current act. It's not the comprehensive work that we were looking for. We've seen the government pull the pin on a lot of the initiatives around organics, the kind of like the compulsory or mandatory elements. I know that there is some work going on around the emissions reduction plan, but a lot of that is very, probably at the very, very bottom of the hierarchy, dealing with emissions from landfill, rather, methane emissions from landfill and trying to capture those or trap those. One thing I'm working on doing for our submission, our bigger zero waste submission, is to just make a list of things I wish had been in here. And, that's, you think about the product policy stuff, the duty of care and licensing stuff, which councils really wanted to see come in. There was in the original consultation 2021, I think it was, there was a whole section on Te Tiriti and, how we incorporate Te Ao Māori and thinking about the role of Māori and organisations in this whole sphere. There's a lot of big gaps and holes. It really is just a very small, kind of tinker on the margins if you think about us trying to make some good progress with this. So I'd really encourage anybody to, have their wish list in there going, I think when they asked me on the radio about it at the beginning, I was like, well, this is a baby step forward, but a baby step forward is better than nothing if we can get a couple of good little outcomes. But there's a whole lot of stuff that we're all aware of that really needs help, we really need some help on. So there is a random question right at the very end, a section that you can put anything else that's not covered by this consultation. So I'd really encourage you to have a think and talk with your mates and come up with a list of things that you really wish were there or that you'd love to see coming up. Yeah.
Cool, thanks, Sue. I'm trying to just pick out the real key questions that you're going to be able to answer, rather than how much would it a really integrated system cost us, I think. So anyway, from Chloe, there was really appreciate your thoughts on investing in the top of the hierarchy. A great reminder about not funneling money into the bottom of the cliff initiatives. And I think that point needs to be made.
Yeah, there's some amazing numbers in one of the Zero Waste Europe documents where they say that, it's just there's really great reason why we've got rubbish systems and recycling systems, because that's what we spend all our money on. There's a really good reason why we don't have repair, recycling, reuse, organics, good organic systems, because we're not spending any money or putting any energy into getting those. All the rules, all the thinking is going into that real bottom layer. And what we know from our kind of the original, the waste strategy before this one, is that they had a real focus on catching up. And really we need to be going, how do we leapfrog? How do we get into a new space? How do we look at what Europe and other places that are ahead of the game are doing now, instead of us, being, just trying to climb up the ladder from recycling to the next thing. We really need to be jumping to the top and using some of those big levers like economic, like environmental taxes and other methods to be able to get some progress happening. As like everyone said, the waste levy it's great to have it, but it just doesn't give us enough money to be able to really make any good progress on those top of the hierarchy things.
Yeah. So Betsy asks whether you've got any recommendations to put a tariff on, or are there any recommendations in there to put a tariff on things like virgin plastic to raise the imported value equal to the recycled plastic value?
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of those tools. If you go back to, what would the whole toolkit look like, then there's you can have taxes on virgin material. You can have all sorts of different ways you can use economic instruments to create a smaller gap, but at the moment what we know is that secondary materials generally are more expensive than virgin because there's so many subsidies and the externalities that are created when we go back to nature and mine virgin materials are not factored into the cost of the system, whereas we are starting to pay some of the costs of collecting, recycling secondary materials. It's really important that we use those tools and levers, and we do really put pressure on the virgin materials, that in a lot of ways that's what eco modulation should really be. It should really be a tool for addressing those types of things. If you try to eco modulate within a EPR fee, you're talking fractions of a cent that you might be changing the price by. But if you can take eco modulation out of that equation and say, let's put let's have a decent tax on single-use things, let's have a decent tax on textiles, let's have a decent tax on something else, and then use that money to invest in the systems that we need to be able to get things happening, then that is a much better and more direct way of doing so.
Yeah. Hannah made the point that so much council money, which is basically our ratepayers' money, is spent on curbside recycling for packaging, which all should be covered by EPR schemes and paid for by producers of the packaging. Anna, following that theme, she says, do you think there is any way an EPR can truly be a producer responsibility without the cost of the scheme being included in the price to the consumer? Would you have any recommendations of how the costs could stay with the producer and not the final consumer?
Well, I think the only thing we can really do is have it be transparent. Like the whole idea of internalizing an externality is that the cost of all of the things which are currently being splattered out across everyone and the environment and the climate are drawn into the product, so that when you go to the shop and you buy something, you can really compare two options. You can say, well, if I buy this in single-use packaging that's come from overseas, that's got all these sort of environmental issues associated with its construction and transport here, compared to going to the shop and paying a little bit more for something down. At the moment, the consumer is always going to pay. That's the game that you play when you're in production and consumption systems. Someone makes something, they sell it to you, they want to sell it to you for more than it costs them to make. And I really think that we need to be using taxes and these economic levers in a much more thoughtful and constructive way to advantage things which have low environmental and social costs, and to penalise things which have a high social and environmental cost. And if you think about how that might work for fast fashion, something which is long lasting, well made, out of natural fibers, etc., or whatever, could be quite a lot more expensive than something buying 10 cheap objects. But if you start to put a tax onto those, then the price starts to equal out. And I think it's really important that we really explore those levers. Yeah.
Louisa, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. I work for council. I see Dana's here. She might be able to answer some of those questions about EPR. And given we got the ministry on here. So I support all of those things. I just want to make a comment about legacy waste and disaster waste and contaminated. Some of the smaller councils are going, if we can't apply to a general fund, we may well be landed with spending all of our levy money cleaning up contaminated sites. That's just a risk. Okay. I agree. I don't see any process on how to add other new materials or products on there. I think that's a serious concern. We're running backwards as fast as we can. The investment categories at the moment reflect the past, and we've been trying to do something for 10 years and nothing has happened. I just like to raise a point that Ontario Blue Box program is a really good example of people look it up, where over a period of 5 years in consultation, they've taken responsibility for packaging in particular. So producers pay the whole cost. There's a very good model in there. It tells you how they achieved it, how they did the rules. And that, in my way of view, is where we should be heading. One of the key outcomes of that is given a responsibility for their own products and material, drove redesign, okay? And that's really what we're trying to do. And I don't see why we haven't got things like reuse in there. And I think we have very poor data gathering. Having worked for 5 years, I know far more recycling actually passes through the commercial sector without going through a disposal facility or a transfer station. And I'd have to ask the Waste Minimisation Fund how they decide to allocate investment when they have no view over what the actual tonnage rates and flows are. That's the only comments I'm going to make on that. I just think they're things I'm thinking about. I'm definitely going to put a wish list on there. We need to deal with textiles and e-waste. Hopefully after 10 or 15 years, I don't know, some progress will be made, but I'm extremely not really happy about that. I'll make another comment, and I think the public medical officer should not review waste minimisation plans. It's pretty subjective. They're pretty busy. They're being taken out of the Litter Act, take them out altogether. And I am concerned that the minister might be able to make us put something into our waste minimisation plan, because they're closing down all their environmental funds very quietly, very quickly, and it looks like they're going to ask us to save fish and plant trees.
Yeah, agreed, Louisa. So John O'Donnell's got a question. Yes, question. Successful recycling needs a field of processors to reuse, stroke, remanufacture the recyclate. New sites link this adjacent to community recycling centres. Do you think we are investing well in the partner strategy to make this work? I think I know the answer to this question, but I'll leave that to you, Sue.
Yeah, I don't think we've really got any kind of coherent story about how it all fits together. I think it's really important that we do get one. You know, we've had, I know we've had lots of conversations about this action and investment plan and this idea about, maybe some sort of coherent national network of facilities and, everyone working together to be able to come up with the best outcomes. But there really isn't a great... there's no one leading any of that. One of the suggestions that we made was that there really needed to be some, back in, I don't know, several consultations ago, was that there needed to be some sort of central body that really was taking charge of driving some of these things and work, pulling together coalitions of people to achieve things. In theory, product stewardship schemes could or should be able to do that because they might have the power and they might have the money and the resources and the kind of like the pulling power to be able to get groups together. But I don't see much will there. They're just kind of happy to do the basics. They're not really prepared to take strategic leadership. So I think it's a pretty tough gig. A lot of the people on the ground feeling quite embattled, like whether I'm talking to councils or recyclers or community operators, it's very hard to know what's really going to happen. We feel like more things are being taken away than are coming forward. And, like I think it was Louisa was saying, that kind of loading down of unfunded, job, lots more jobs to do with very little funds attached. So I think that that's a really important thing for us all to say.
Matthew Hayes got a question. With construction and demolition being such a big part of landfill waste, is there a move to have construction products and suppliers to become part of EPR scheme?
I haven't heard of any formal processes to pull them in into the 6 priority product schemes that we, I've got those 6 priority product schemes going now. Ministry has been reluctant to start any new ones while they're all in train. I know that when we were doing our submissions and working on the emissions reduction plan, that the building industry did have some of the best ways of thinking about embodied emissions and what the consequences were of their activities. But I also know that I did a submission a few weeks ago on procurement and government procurement policy, and one of the things that was being pulled out of that was waste minimisation and consideration of emissions as part of procurement. So I'd say that we're on a bit of a hiding to nothing with that one as well.
Yeah.
I know there are some of the organisations like Marley's doing a bit of work with their spouting, but I really haven't seen any numbers to say whether it's a token gesture or whether they're getting any kind of scale with it, or whether, I haven't really heard whether they're willing to pay what it would cost to really start to harvest big quantities of material.
Yep. there's a question from Karen Heighton. Thanks so much, Sue. You mentioned that Zero Waste Network does not support the proposal for levy funds to be used for activities that reduce environmental harm or increase environmental benefits. Are there any questions in the consultation document that you oppose or would answer no to?
Yep, that's one of them. It's like, I'd have to look at my, let me see. There's question, so we're saying, definitely saying no to question. I'm just trying to find it. Must be in 3. It's in our submission guide online, the one we're saying no to. So there's A to E. There's 5 different things they're saying what should councils be able to spend their waste levy funds on. I hear the pain from councils around having to go into using levy money to cover the costs of cleanup activity, like vulnerable landfills, etc. But I feel as though drawing the line at any other type of environmental activity, so water, sewerage, all those types of things, I really don't think we should be spending our waste levy money on any of those broader environmental projects. That's not because they're not worthy. Like obviously, regeneration or of Kaipara Harbour is a worthy project. I just don't think we should be spending waste levy money on that. I don't think we should have its own budget. It should have its own funds coming in from its own source. And I think it's really important that we continue to stick up for that. If you think about how difficult it is around the table in council at the moment to try to, get progress on some of these waste initiatives, imagine how much harder it would be if everyone around the table had their eye on your waste levy funds to be able to use that money for their favourite project.
Yep. So I've just put a link to our submission page on the chat for everyone if you've not seen that, and that will answer questions like that Sue's just talked through, and that's those documents are sort of live documents, aren't they, Sue? So
yeah,
there's still amendments going in. If there's anything that comes out of this webinar, then we can add those to those example submissions, and you can use them and put stuff into your own words, obviously.
Yeah, and so we're just trying to, as people come up with good ideas about things we could or should have said, then we're adding them in. Yeah, so just gradually doing that over time. And then obviously Zero Waste Network will be putting together a much more comprehensive submission ourselves that hoping to have done, middle of next week to go into the process as well. So that a bit more detail in that one.
Okay, and Angela Baker just states consumers paying the full real price seems reasonable and may reduce consumption. Yeah.
If you know what the real story is, then you're in a much better position to be able to make a good decision. If there's a lot of hidden costs and you don't really understand how any of the pricing works, it's very confusing and much harder to be able to make good decisions when you're standing there trying to pick between options.
Yeah. So, and Sophie mentioned as an example, the waste disposal levy received by QLDC, Queenstown Lakes, is only 2.5% of what the council spends on all its waste minimisation management activities. Yeah. So for some councils it's quite low. So we need more money to going in to support councils, and less reliance on ratepayers for covering costs.
Yeah, if people can figure that out for themselves and put it into their submissions, I think that's really important, because one of the lines that, for example, the Waste and Recycling Industry Forum are saying is that, we've got, so, all this waste levy money is just, sitting there. We really need to get it spent on other things so it's not competing with commercial activities. But, we've got so much work to do in either cleaning up or going up the hierarchy that, no one's really interested in competing on services that are already there. That, that 2% or 3%, it's not a drop in the bucket compared to what council's already spending on all this other stuff anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if people could see those numbers, I think that would make a big difference about what people are saying. Like when you hear the number of 30 million or 200 million or 300 million, it sounds like a lot of money, but when you break it down to what each council receives, it's actually only a very small proportion of the money that we're spending on this stuff.
Yeah, I think I've got most comments and questions, and I apologize if I've missed yours. Yeah, so I think unless anyone's got a really urgent question that you want to put your hand up and speak, I think we should probably close shortly. And thank you everybody for contributing to this. It's been really useful. So awesome work as always. And yeah, please encourage your everybody you know to put in submissions. And that's the only way we're going to get any change. So last comment.
Yeah, I think I'd just say the same, like definitely put in a submission yourself, whether it's sort of the cup of tea version that you bang out in a few minutes or the longer version where you put a bit more detail in. It's a real numbers game. The government will care about things, maybe they won't care about things to the extent that, submissions go in, but I know that, if we start to get in the thousands of submissions, then they really do take it a bit more seriously than if there's only a few hundred. So the more submissions that go in, rope your friends and neighbors, the people that work at your sites, make sure that everyone really understands how important it is. And then we've got our guide there saying what we've got going on, our thinking, the kind of our main points. There's a short cup of tea guide on our website and then a bit of a longer one. So yeah, just use that as a resource if you find it useful.
Yeah, definitely. It doesn't have to be complex to put a submission in. If you've got no time, just look at the short one.
Yeah.
Put this important stuff to you.
Yeah, just echo what Karen said, and thanks so much for making the time to come along. It's really great to hear different people talking and the thoughts from everyone's thoughts, because by sharing what each of us knows, we're going to be able to put forward much better ideas. And had quite a few people reach out already with ideas and suggestions just from them having gone to the website, have a look at the short submission, and they're getting in touch, making suggestions about what they think is important as well. So we can add all that into our longer version.
Okay, I'll close with a karakia. Unuhia ki te urutapu nui kia wātea, kia mama, te nāko, te tinana, te wairua I te ara takata. Koia rā e rongo, whakairia aki ki runga kia tina.
Tina.
Hui e tai
Nā mihi nui, everybody. Thank you so much.